From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ron Charles, the fiction editor of the Washington Post Book World, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. Before we begin, I've been asked to remind you that these proceedings are being recorded for all time by the Library of Congress, which may broadcast them at some future date. After the author's presentation, there'll be time for questions from the audience from these two microphones. One's there and one's there. So if you don't want to become part of the library's permanent collection, just stay in your seat. It's not fair having to introduce a great writer of memoir, because she's already done it so well. As you know, Jeannette Walls was born in Phoenix, and she and her siblings had a difficult childhood in a strange but intense family that was constantly on the move. So bizarre was her upbringing that she kept it a secret, even while she tried to write about it for 20 years. She tried to write it as a novel at one point. But finally, coaxed on by a close friend, the man she eventually married, she wrote The Glass Castle, which has been a bestseller for almost 3 years, has sold more than 2 million copies in this country, and has been translated into 24 languages. But for most of her career, she spent as a journalist. She worked at New York Magazine, Esquire, USA Today, and for many years was a gossip columnist for MSNBC. Her upcoming book, Half Broke Horses, is an account of her life with her grandmother on the American frontier. You can look for that in bookstores just next week. Please join me in welcoming Jeannette Walls.
Thank you. Thank you. It is such a great joy to be here, surrounded by so many wonderful readers and so many big deal authors. I sort of feel this is an honor I don't deserve. I'm just a girl with a story. But the telling of that story has changed my life. And among other things, it made me see what a knucklehead I was for so many years. So with our time together, what I would like to do is share with you some of the things that I have learned since the publication of my book. It gives me such great pleasure to share my story, and that's ironic because for so long my story was a source of shame for me. As Ron mentioned, I used to write about celebrities for a living. That's not the source of shame. Perhaps it should be, but it's not. The day that I was heading to some fabulous party and saw a homeless woman rooting through the garbage and realized it was my mother, and getting together with her a couple of days later and asking her, what the heck am I supposed to tell people when they ask me about you? And her telling me, just tell the truth, is really what changed my life. It seemed like such a simple challenge, but at the same time it seemed impossible. How could I ever explain to people why my mother, who's an intelligent and resourceful woman, would be living on the streets? But moreover, what kind of a monster of a daughter would live on Park Avenue and write about celebrities while my mother was living on the streets? At the same time, I felt it was something that I had to do. I felt like a fraud and a phony. But there was no doubt in my mind that once people knew the truth about me, that I was going to lose everything. I was completely convinced I would be fired from my job, that I would lose all my friends and lose whatever meager little standing I'd carved out for myself in this world. So I'm sitting there trying to rise to Mom's challenge and tell the truth, and I thought, why am I doing this? I've got this great job. I go on television. I have my own column. I have a flush toilet. What more could anybody want in life, you know? And I developed a fantasy for my story. Now, any author who tells you they don't have a fantasy for their book is lying to you, because it is an excruciating process, sitting there staring at the word processor, typewriter, or whatever you use, and you tell yourself stories. Oh, when my book comes out, maybe such and such will happen. I never dreamed of the bestseller list. That was too ambitious. I never dreamed of any prizes or awards. My fantasy became that if my story came out, that a rich kid would read it. I was hoping that a rich kid, and by that I mean somebody whose folks paid the bills on time, that a rich kid would read it and would come to understand what it's like to grow up on the other side of the tracks, what it's like to have this weird combination of shame and pride about your parents and yourself. And then as I worked a little bit longer on it, I developed an even bolder and more ambitious ambition. And that was that somebody who grew up like me would read it and would get the same sense of hope that I got from reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And so that's what got me through telling my story and facing what I was certain would be shame and humiliation. Well, I have to say that readers have been so much smarter and so much more compassionate than I ever dreamed possible. I cannot tell you how many people have come to me and have told me, have let me see myself through their eyes, and that's sort of what allowed me to forgive myself for my own past. But perhaps more shockingly, the number of people who've come up to me and said, you know, the details of our lives are very different, but you and I have a lot in common. And sometimes they start telling me their stories, and sometimes they're crying when they tell me. Sometimes they had these rough Scrabble backgrounds like I did, but sometimes they were raised in what seems like great luxury, but they had an alcoholic father or a slightly loopy mom, and they tell me their stories, and they're these amazing inspirational stories, and I think, why would you be ashamed of that? I remember, oh yeah, I was ashamed too. So I think that, you know, shame, somebody who was very wise once said to me that secrets are like vampires. They can survive only in the darkness, and they suck the life out of you. But once they're exposed to the light, there's a moment of horror, then poof, they lose their power over you. But so not long after the publication, I got to get back to my ambitions about my book. Not long after the publication of my book, a very pretty young girl approached me. She said she read my story while she was vacationing in the Caribbean. And she said, she's a cheerleader, and she said there's this girl, she said there's a girl in her class. She said she wears these nasty, ugly, out-of-date clothes, and her hair is all greasy. And she said, and we all make fun of her. And she said, and now I understand. And now I will never make fun of her again. And I thought, the Lord can strike me down with lightning right now. I have done my job on this planet. I have made, thank you, honey, I have made that one rich kid understand. But then not long after that, a teacher came to me, and she said she had one of her students read my book. She teaches in northern Alabama, sort of rough Scrabble area. And she said a young man who had never read a book cover to cover started toting my book around with him. And she said, I thought you don't like reading. He said, I don't. She said, I thought you don't like books at all. She said, I hate books. I said, well, why do you like that particular book? And he thinks for a second, and he said, this here is a fine white trash story. And then the teacher added very quickly and a little bit nervously, I believe he meant that as a compliment. But I took it as a compliment. In fact, it is perhaps the greatest compliment I have ever received. Because if a young man, first of all, who thinks he doesn't like books, but moreover, who thinks of himself as trash, can hear my story and say, hey, you know something? She's not that different from me. And that if a popular cheerleader can read my story and say, hey, you know something? She's not that different from me. That, to me, is why we tell our stories. It's, you know, I think that we memoirists get a little bit of a bum rap, that we're exhibitionists or something like that. And I don't believe that at all. What you're doing, you're not airing your dirty laundry. You're saying, this is my story. And maybe you can learn something from it without the nasty business of actually having to have lived it. And what I have found from people is only compassion and kindness and a desire to connect and to understand what it was like to have this childhood, what it was like, and it elicits great conversations. And as I said, a number of people coming up to me and saying, you know, I know what you went through, I went through something like that. In thinking about what is the truth, you have to figure out, you know, somebody who's much wiser than me once said, the truth is a liquid and not a solid, and it takes many shapes. So when you're writing, even if when you're writing nonfiction, even though it's true, you shape your truths by which stories you choose to tell. When I sat down to write my story, I was 40 years old, so I had a lot of anecdotes to choose from. And the very favorite memory from my entire childhood was when I was 5 years old. And we had no money for Christmas presents. And my father took each of his children out into the desert night, and he gave us as a Christmas present whichever star in the sky we wanted. I've never been much of one for subtlety, so I chose the brightest one. It was Venus. Dad had to explain to me that Venus wasn't a star at all, it was just a planet. I wanted it anyway. Dad said, what the heck, it's Christmas, you want a planet, you got a planet. And he gave me Venus. And it's my most treasured gift and my most treasured story ever. To this day, when I see Venus up in the sky, I think, honey, that is mine, I own that. And so when my father died, I told that story at his funeral. After I finished, my sister Lori, who's 3 years older than me and always has been a little smarter than me, always saw right through my dad's BS, she crossed her arms and said, isn't that like that sorry SOB dad of ours to go give away something that doesn't belong to him in the first place? And I thought about it. Lori was absolutely right. Dad's giving me Venus was a completely meaningless gesture. But I'm right, too. It was a priceless treasure. It is whatever you choose to make of it. And I think that you could say the same of the glass castle itself. You know, it was another one of my father's drunken dreams and another one of his unfulfilled promises. Or you can see it as a hope and a dream for the future. And that's the way I chose to see it, a belief that maybe all of this moving around and digging food out of garbage cans and sleeping in cardboard boxes, that was temporary. That one of these days I would actually have a nice place to live. And I've come to believe that is a much more valuable gift. Thank you. I've been fascinated by people's reactions to my story. Some people think that my parents were monsters who should have had their children locked up, and some think that they were certainly flawed characters, but that they had gifts as well, and that they passed those gifts along to their children. Sometimes reading groups will approach me and they'll say, we had a big old argument about your book, which of us is right? And I say that you're both right, you're all right. It's all how you choose to perceive it. There's one more story, bear with me, that I want to tell you about a teacher. I love teachers. I think that good teachers are saints walking this planet. If I keep on, I do. I think that if you can give a child the gift of knowledge, of learning, a passion for education, you've given them a great treasure that they will have their entire lives. So I just, and some people have asked me why I'm not bitter or upset about my childhood. I got that from my parents, and I got a sense of self-esteem. And I think that the rest is all bonus. Ideally, you also get food and clothing, I'll admit that. But the sense of self-esteem is amazing. One more story about a teacher. There was a teacher in a rough Rust Belt area, and she had her kids read The Glass Castle because she was trying to get them to read stories about poverty. And there's one, if it sounds like I'm bragging about my book, I am. But I'm not bragging about my book. I'm bragging about the power of storytelling, the power of sharing your stories. But anyway, this teacher was trying to get these kids to read about poverty because there was one student in particular she wanted to reach. And she said, this is a good girl, but she's had a couple of brushes with the law, and she just wanted to get through to this young woman. And so this young woman came into the class one day, and she threw The Glass Castle on the table. She said, that is a very upsetting book to me. And the teacher said, why is that? She goes, there's an episode where the mother takes 3 kids shoplifting and gets clothes for one of the kids. That was wrong. And this teacher's thinking, oh, this is great. I can have this conversation with this young woman about breaking the law and crime and punishment. And the teacher says, what in particular bothered you about that scene? And this young woman says, if you go shoplifting for one of the kids, you got to get something for all of them. And the teacher said it was quite the eye-opener for her because she'd always thought of this young woman as a rule breaker. And then she came to realize this woman isn't a rule breaker at all. She was just taught a different set of rules. And so I think that that's what memoirs and biographies, that's what they do, is they take you inside somebody else's life. And they make you see this is what you would be like if your circumstances were different. I think, we all define other people in different ways. We stick labels on crazy homeless people or shallow gossip columns, thinking that we know who and what they are. But everybody has a story. Everybody, there's something behind everybody. And I'm on this campaign right now to get everybody to write their own story, their own memoir. Whether you want to show it to anybody or not, that's your choice. I think if you show it to somebody, take it from me, people are kinder and wiser than we give them credit for being. They're much more trustworthy. If you're not ready to do that, that's okay too. But I think everybody should tell their story. If not to other people, at least to yourself, and figure yourself out. People have asked me, how could you forgive your parents? The only person I had to forgive was myself. Because I think that those of us who pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, we can carry around a lot of sort of survival guilt or mixed feelings about doing better than your parents and leaving your siblings behind. It's very complicated. And coming clean with your story, these neat patterns emerge. And like I said, readers are so smart. I was at one event, a reader asked me something, and she said, why did your mother do such and such? I said, I don't know. And I've asked my mother, and I can't get a straight answer from her. Another woman in the audience raises her hand. She said, I know. I said, you do? She said, yeah, my book club discussed it. And I was like, oh, okay. So she had a good theory, too. So some people have asked me, is it weird to go around talking about your family and having all these people discussing members of your family as though they know it? And it's never been weird, just because people are so kind and so smart. In fact, time and time again, readers have been smarter than I am. As I said, people have very different reactions to my parents. And the questions I get most about I get the most questions about are my mother. People have really sort of wildly mixed feelings about her. Some people have said, your father, I understand. I understand alcoholism. Your mother's a mystery to me. And I would often discuss my mother with them. And usually their faces would light up with illumination, that sort of aha moment. And usually they would end the conversation by saying, your next book should be about your mother. I'm like, I don't know, Mom, she's a crazy lady, I don't know. But they just kept on insisting, time and time again, your next book should be about your mother. And I've been sort of kicking around for somebody to write about because I have no imagination. I can't make things up. It's ironic to me that I'm in this particular attempt, but let's not even go there. But so eventually I proposed the idea to my mother. She no longer is on the streets. I'm happy to say that the abandoned building where she was living several years ago, for more than 15 years, without heat or running water, caught on fire. And I've been trying to get my mother to come down and live with me in Virginia. Not with me in my house because I'm not a saint, but we have a little place out back. And she kept on resisting. She said, Jeannette, I live in the most exciting city in the world. I don't want to go down and live in Virginia. That's the sticks. I said, but Mom, you live on the streets. And she said, I'm not some sort of a moocher. I'm not a freeloader. Live with my daughter and son-in-law. I said, Mom, we're thinking of getting horses and we could really use the help. She said, I'll be right there. And it was a valuable lesson for me in terms of, if we want to help somebody, if you can give them a sense of self-esteem and an idea that they're helping themselves and helping you as well, that they're much more inclined to accept your help. And they might even surprise you by really being helpful and rising to the occasion. And Mom has been fabulous with the horses. And she's been fabulous with other things, too. Not long ago, she came in this really good mood. She was very happy about something. I said, Mom, what are you so happy about? She said, the most wonderful thing happened to me today. I said, what? She said, I fell off a horse. Now, my mother is the ultimate optimist. She can put a positive spin on anything. But I was thinking, how could even Mom think that falling off a horse is a good thing? So I asked her, I said, Mom, what could be good about that? She said, well, Jeannette, anybody can ride, but knowing how to fall takes great talent. And I thought there's a great deal of wisdom in that, especially with the economy that we're facing. When times are good, we can all just sail along. It's knowing how to land on your behind and then pick yourself back up and get a moving. And those of us who can pick ourselves up are really the truly lucky ones. And the truly, truly lucky ones among us are the ones who can give somebody else a hand and say, can I help you up? And inevitably, in my experience, if somebody's willing to accept that help, that they can be a big asset to you. And so the ironic thing for me is that this woman who for so long was a source of shame for me, who I sort of wanted to disappear from the planet, I didn't want her to die, but I just wanted her to go away, has actually become not only a source of inspiration for me, but the source of my next book. Because eventually when I proposed the idea of, well, how about I write a story about you, she was all for it. She thought it was a great idea. And I interviewed her every day for a year. And not one time did she say, oh, that's too personal, let's not go there. She's just very forthcoming. My mother cannot remember my phone number, but she has this amazing recall for the history of Arizona and the various Indian tribes and which are related to this. I was just stunned. I was taking notes around. She must be wrong on all this. And I go back and Google it, and she was dead on all of it. So I said, Mom, why do you know all this stuff and you don't even know your own phone number? She said, my phone number's not that interesting. She was great about it, but while I was interviewing her, she kept saying, this book should not be about me. This should be about my mother. At first I resisted because my grandmother died when I was about 8 years old, and I couldn't interview her, and I have no imagination. I tried to, as Ron mentioned, I tried to fictionalize the Glass Castle, and I couldn't think of fake names for us, so I used all our middle names, And it just, I couldn't think, how am I supposed to change this? Because everybody did what they did, because that's in character. And, am I supposed to say that the FBI really was after my father? So I didn't know what to change. But as I'm interviewing Mom, like I said, she kept on saying this next book should be about my mother. And I resisted because I couldn't interview my grandmother, who died when I was 8 years old. But she was this amazing character. She was born in 1901. In a dugout. I don't mean on a baseball field. I mean on a riverbank, a dugout. And she trained horses, and she was a school teacher by the time she was 15. Didn't have a high school degree herself. And I thought Mom was right, that she did have an amazing story. So I wrote the story from her perspective in first person, with the intention of changing it back to third person and qualifying the stuff I didn't know by saying, it is believed that, or the evidence suggests. But then I showed it to my agent, and she said, keep everything exactly as it is. So we decided to slap the label fiction on it. We're calling it a true life novel, which it was a phrase that actually Norman Mailer used in The Executioner song. But it's just a family story. And like we all have, that we were told by our parents and our grandparents. And even though I think that Lily, my grandmother, was an exceptional woman in so many ways, just tough broad. She was just this woman. She'd whip out her choppers or whip out her handgun equally quickly. And she just, she was a tough old lady and did what had to be done. So in some ways, I think she was an extraordinary woman. In other ways, she's extraordinarily common. I think a lot of people will recognize themselves or maybe their grandparents in her. And I that is my hope for this book, that it makes other people think about their own stories, their own histories. And their ability, so many people have said to me, in fact, a gentleman just said this to me earlier, I could have never survived what you did. And even though I'm very flattered by that compliment, of course you could. Of course you could. We're all tougher than we think. Some of you have probably survived much worse. I was at some event and everybody was saying, how could you be so strong? And this woman sort of meekly raised her hand. She said, I'm from Somalia. She didn't have it so bad. I think that we're all tough old broads and tough old coots. And if you just look in your history, you'll realize we all come from this really hardy stock. Whether you came over, their ancestors came over from the potato famine or came over on slave ships, or just came over to get away from the Holocaust. We all have what it takes to survive, and give yourself some credit and look at your own stories. And my hope for Half-Broke Horses is folks will read it and like that poor white trash kid and like that popular kid will just say, hey, you know something? She's not that different from me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Ask anything. If I don't know the answer, maybe somebody's book club discussed it.
Son had first read it, had been recommended it to him from his friend
great.
in middle school, recommended it to me, and then we passed it on through the family. Anyhow, my question to you is, has your mother's read the book? right?
Yeah.
And her reaction?
Well, I was I offered to show it to Mom before publication, and she wasn't that interested in reading it. She was in the middle of a really good Zane Grey book, so she passed on it. And she didn't read it until it became a bestseller. If I really wrestled with some of those scenes, should I include them? In particular, the chocolate scene. For those of you who haven't read the book, there's an episode where we kids were going hungry and Mom was eating chocolate. And I can't tell me the reader said, your dad had me until the pool hall scene, your mom had me until the chocolate scene. So I really wrestled with whether or not to include that because I could have left it out. And nobody would have said, hey, there's a plot hole here. And I decided to go ahead and include it. And if Mom had read it before publication and said, please take this out, I couldn't have said, the public has the right to know, Mom. But after she read it, like I said, it was already out, and she had no problem with that. No problem whatsoever. She was a little upset by my description of her driving. Other than that, she doesn't seem to have any real problem, which she said a couple of times. I don't see things quite the way you do, but I understand that you had to tell the truth as you saw it. And I think, that's a pretty darn with all the things I said about her, you got to hand it to Mom. You can accuse her of a lot of things, but being a control freak is not one of them. So, thank you.
This is not a question, but a very quick 1-minute story to add to your teacher collection. I'm the librarian at a public charter school here in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago, a new English teacher came to our high school, and she came and she said to me, I've never taught high school before. She said, how do you think I should start each day? I said, I think it's really important, even at the high school level, that the teachers read aloud something to their class, just for pleasure and enjoyment. She said, well, what should I start with? I said, I don't know. I said, I've always found at any level that Charlotte's Web works very well, but I said, I just finished a book that I think would really work very well. Well, of course, it was The Glass Castle. What I want to tell you, though, is that for the next 3 years, she had 4 classes each year. She read The Glass Castle to every one of her classes for 3 years. That's 12 times that she read aloud The Glass Castle. She never censored a word. She read every word as written. And the other thing, she cried every time your father died. The last thing is she'd be here today, but I guess the stress was too much for her. After 3 years, she decided to take a year off. She's riding her bike down the Continental Trail.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's amazing. Thank you.
Jeannette, 2 quick questions.
Yes.
How are your siblings, especially Maureen?
Yeah.
And number 2, I have a friend who's an orthodontist. She was very concerned about your teeth. Did your homemade braces work? Your teeth are absolutely beautiful. Did you have to go to a real orthodontist?
You called me out on that, honey. You called me out. These very fine choppers that you see are the result of professional dentistry. Yeah. My very first paycheck, I went and got braces, and my orthodontist gave me a really hard time for not getting braces when I was a kid. He said I had the worst overbite he'd ever seen, and I did not tell him about my do-yourself efforts because I didn't think he'd be impressed. But an orthodontist told me my technology actually was good and it would have worked. My siblings, my older sister Lori is still an artist. She's still in Manhattan. My kid sister Maureen is living in California in a clean, safe place. She's not setting the world on fire with her career, but that's okay. One of the many blessings that's come as a result of the Glass Castles is we're back in touch. I'm trying to get her to come live with me and my husband in Virginia, but she says she never wants to live where it snows ever again. I keep telling her, Maureen, the cold's not so bad when you got a thermostat. You just move the little old thing and it just... this has to be her decision, and I'm trying to sort of accept that. But the chapter on that is not necessarily finished. I'm still working on that. My brother has retired from the police force. He's no longer with the Gestapo. He is a 9th grade English teacher, and I could not be more proud of him. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Go, Brian. And he's a great teacher. He really is. Thank you.
Hi, Jeannette. My daughter is a junior at Barnard, and when she was first year, you came and spoke to her class, which she loved. And I just wondered anything you say about being at Barnard and how it helped you.
I love being at Barnard, and I loved going back and speaking to that class. One of my few regrets about the Glass Castles, I wish I would have changed the name of the Barnard professor who called me out when I said, she said, what do you know about homelessness? And I said, nothing, and I never meant to humiliate her. I was was not trying to get even with anybody. I think Barnard is a wonderful place, and this was the woman who inspired me to become a political science major. And I was so impressed with those girls. They were so smart and asked the best questions. So good luck to her. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, thank you. Loved your book, passed it on to many people
Thank
who have
you.
also loved it. My question is about your mother, and it's similar to what you've already said about people not understanding her. And while I was fascinated by your non-judgmental take on it, did you ever try to explore, or anybody else help you explore? Was she mentally ill? What the illness might have been?
Right.
What was driving her really bizarre
Right.
behavior in regards to her children?
Mom has never been diagnosed with any mental illness, as far as I know. She's certainly loopy. She's loopy. I mean, I don't know if that's a diagnosis, but I keep on quoting other people, other readers, because they're smarter than I am. And now I'm going to quote Rosie O'Donnell, who was a big fan of The Glass Castle. I went on The View. It was the best interview I've ever done because I couldn't get in a word edgewise. They were all fighting about... But Joy Behar hated my mother. She said, "That nut, I can't believe you're letting that nut live with you. You know, she is mentally ill, you know that?" And Rosie jumped in and she said, there's a whole spectrum of mental illness, all the way from seasonal affect disorder to schizophrenia. And she said, most creative people are somewhere in between, as am I. And certainly Mom has disorders. I recently read a fascinating biography called My Stroke of Insight, in which this woman lost use of the left side of her brain and became completely right-brained. And it was like reading Rosetta Stone on my mom. She's a total right-brain person. Now that she's living with me, I have a great relationship with her. She's a hoot. She's a lot of fun if you're not looking for her to take care of you. My husband, that handsome devil sitting right there, gets along even better with her. Gets along even better with her than I do. She just thinks differently. I don't, the whole definition of mental illness, I don't know. It's very complicated. And I hope that Half-Broke Horses will help explain a little bit more about, if not what's going on inside her head, her journey. Thank you.
You were just mentioning the role that you think that mental illness can play in what shapes a writer. And earlier, when John Grisham was here, he was talking about how Mark Twain was one of his idols. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that Mark Twain had a daughter who was epileptic, who drowned in a bathtub. And I think that man was never the same afterwards. Yeah. And I was just wondering what your opinion is of how emotional trauma or just a very tough life
how a tough life affects you.
Can it make you a better writer?
I think that everything in life is both a blessing and a curse. I think everything is, and that it's entirely up to us which one we choose to focus on. One of the blessings from my childhood is that I'm a scrapper and a fighter, and one of the curses from my life is that I'm a scrapper and a fighter. And it took me a long time to sort of understand that at a certain point in life it's okay to stop fighting. But I think that these difficulties that we all face, no matter how horrible the experience, there's a very valuable blessing wrapped inside if you are willing to receive that gift. But it's not always easy. It's not always easy. I am over time. So I guess I'm getting the hook here. So thank you very much. Thank you. I'm sorry. We'll talk afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.